Can anyone in this room make that shot? 1 round. Iron sights. No spotter. Right now.
Can anyone in this room make that shot? 1 round, iron sights, no spotter, right now. 26 Scout Sniper Instructor candidates, the elite of an elite, men who had already survived a selection course that breaks the strongest, stared at the polished floor and said nothing at all. And then, from the very back of the room, a 78-year-old man in a faded grey work shirt, a man who had spent the entire briefing quietly emptying a trash can into a rolling cart, set down a wad of crumpled paper towels and lifted one weathered hand into the air. The general turned. The room went silent, and somebody near the front laughed. If you believe an old man's hands can still remember what his heart never forgot, type honour in the comments right now, because what happened in the next 11 minutes left a 4-star general standing at attention with his cover held against his chest. His name was Harlan Webb, and for 19 years he had been the man who kept the grass cut and the ranges clean at the Marine Corps Scout Sniper Instructor School aboard Quantico, Virginia. He arrived every morning at 4:40 in an old tan Ford pickup that idled rough in the cold and smelled faintly of cut grass and 2-stroke oil, and he parked it in the same spot under the same loblolly pine, far from the building where it would never be in anybody's way. He walked with a slight hitch in his left hip, the kind of walk that comes from carrying something heavy across hard country a long time ago, and yet he kept his back straighter than a man his age had any right to. The spine of someone who had been taught once, brutally. That posture was a discipline and not a comfort. The instructors called him Mr. Webb when they thought to call him anything at all, and most days they did not think to. He emptied their trash and he raked the spent brass off the firing lines into coffee cans, and he repainted the steel targets when the rounds chewed them down to bare silver, and he never, not once in 19 years, said a single word about the rifles cracking 40 feet from where he worked. He only listened to them, the way a man listens to a song he used to know by heart and has tried for half a century to forget. In the buttoned front pocket of that faded grey shirt, never removed, never explained, he carried a single brass cartridge, dented at the base, that nobody at the school had ever thought to ask him about. If they had, they would have learned something that would have changed forever the careless way they said his name. There were small things about Harlan Webb that the school never thought to read, the way you do not read a language you have never been taught. He ate his lunch alone every day at the same weathered picnic table behind the equipment shed, a sandwich wrapped in wax paper that he made himself each morning at 4 in the dark, and he ate it slowly, facing the ranges, listening to the rhythm of fire. He could tell you, without ever looking up, which line was running drills and which was running for record, because the cadence of disciplined men is different from the cadence of men under pressure, and he had spent the best and worst years of his life learning to hear that difference. Once, a young candidate named Alvarez, struggling and half broken by the course, and certain he was about to be dropped, had sat down across from him without asking, and stared at the dirt and said nothing for 10 minutes, and Harlan had let the silence sit, and then said only, "It ain't the wind that beats a man out here, it's the waiting. You learn to be still inside the waiting. The rest comes." Alvarez had looked at him a long moment, this old grass cutter, and then nodded and gone back to the line, and he had graduated 3 weeks later, and he never knew why those words had steadied him, only that they had. Harlan's evenings were quieter still. He kept a small clapboard house at the edge of town with a single chair set facing a window, and on the sill of that window sat a framed photograph of a woman with kind eyes and a folded flag in a triangular case, and beside them, a second photograph of 2 sunburned boys grinning in tall grass on the far side of the world. He did not talk to them out loud the way some lonely men do. He just sat with them in the long blue evenings until it was time to sleep, and to wake sometimes, gasping, from a ridge he had walked off of 51 years before and never entirely left. The morning the general came, the whole school had been scrubbed and squared away for 3 full days. A 4-star visit was rare. This one was rarer still, because the general was not just any flag officer. He was the senior Marine still alive who had himself once worn a sniper's ghillie suit in combat, and the schoolhouse treated his arrival the way an old cathedral treats a returning bishop. Floors were stripped and waxed, brass was polished. The lawns Harlan tended were trimmed to a putting green nap, and somebody had told him sharply the evening before to keep his cart out of the photographs and stay out of the way. So he worked the quiet edges of the room while the general's aides set up the briefing, while the 26 candidates filed in with their high and tights and their pressed camis and their easy, unbroken young confidence. Harlan watched them the way he watched everything, without ever seeming to watch at all. He noticed which of them had the still eyes for the trade, and which of them only had the swagger that gets mistaken for it. He had been quietly noticing that about men for 60 years, in jungles and on ranges and across the rims of 100 coffee cups, and he was rarely wrong. As he bent to scrape a smear of boot polish off the linoleum near the back wall, the brass cartridge in his shirt pocket pressed cold and familiar against his chest, and for just a moment his hand stopped moving entirely, because the general had begun to speak, and the general had just said a name Harlan Webb had not heard spoken aloud in 51 years. The name was Hill 55. The general was telling the candidates about the men who had built the trade they were about to inherit and pass on, about the Republic of Vietnam, about the legends of the 1st Marine Division who had crawled for days through elephant grass and flooded paddies to earn a single shot, about the white feather snipers whose confirmed engagements had become a kind of scripture inside that very schoolhouse. He spoke of impossible distances and more impossible patience, of men who lay so still for so long that the insects walked across their open eyes, of men who could read the wind by the way it bent the rice. Every candidate in the room leaned forward, hungry, because these were the exact stories that had pulled them out of small towns and into this place. Not one of them noticed the old groundskeeper at the back of the room go very still, the damp rag forgotten in his hand. Not one of them noticed that when the general described a particular engagement, on a particular ridge, in the cold autumn of 1969, the old man's jaw set and his eyes fixed on a middle distance that was not anywhere inside those walls. The general finished his history and let it hang in the bright air a moment. Then he smiled, the way a man smiles right before he tests you, and said that history was a fine thing, but the present was what mattered, and that he wanted to see today, with his own eyes, what this school was truly made of. The range master led them all out onto Range 11, where a fresh wind was coming hard and unsteady off the Potomac lowlands, gusting and dying and gusting again from a different quarter, the worst and most treacherous kind of wind a shooter can be handed. 1,000 yards out, and then 400 more beyond that, sat a single 12-inch steel plate, freshly white-painted, small as a dinner plate at that range and seeming to shrink further by the second under the heat shimmer rising off the grass. 1,400 yards. The general had the range master set a rifle on the line, and pointedly, deliberately, not one of the sleek modern precision rifles with their dialing scopes and ballistic computers that the candidates trained on every day, but an old bolt-action gun wearing nothing but iron sights, a plain front post and a rear aperture, an insult to the easy electronics of the modern trade and a question all by itself. 1 round in the chamber. No spotter to call the wind, no second set of eyes, no second chance. The general turned to face the 26 and asked his question in that window-rattling voice. Who would take the shot? A 1,400-yard cold-bore shot, iron sights, full-value crosswind alone. The candidates looked at the plate. They looked at the wind flag standing straight out and snapping on their poles. They looked at the dirt between their boots, and every one of those proud young men kept his hand at his side, because they all knew the same brutal arithmetic. The shot could not be made by mortal hands, and the man who missed it in front of a 4-star general would carry the smell of that miss for the rest of his career. The silence stretched out long and humiliating across the firing line. The general's smile faded by slow degrees into something flat and hard. He had not expected 26 volunteers, but he had expected one. He had expected at least one of these young men to let the swagger he saw in their walk follow them down onto the line and put a hand up, even knowing he would likely miss because there had once been a time when wanting the chance mattered more than fearing the failure. Instead, he watched 26 trained snipers calculate the cost and decide quietly that the math did not favour them. It is a particular and lonely kind of disappointment, watching the people you have spent your whole life believing in decline, the very test you built your life around, and the general let them feel the full weight of it. He said nothing for 10 long seconds. The wind flag snapped. A gull cried out somewhere over the grey river, and it was into that brittle, shameful silence, full of young men studying the laces of their own boots, that a voice came from the back of the formation, not loud, not proud, just plain and level and certain, the voice of a man stating a simple fact rather than making a bold claim. "I'll take it," the old groundskeeper said, and the laughter began before he had even finished the sentence. It was a young instructor named Staff Sergeant Cody Renner who laughed first and loudest. Renner was 29 years old, the lead marksmanship instructor for the senior candidate class, a genuinely gifted rifleman who had won 2 service rifle championships and who wore that fact the way certain men wear too much cologne, heavy, deliberate, noticeable from clear across a room. He had spent 3 days quietly resenting the disruption of the general's visit, the extra hours, the scrubbing, the way the whole school had been made to hold its breath, and he had been looking, without quite knowing it, for somewhere to set that resentment down. And now here it was, gift-wrapped and handed to him, a wrinkled old janitor in a trash-stained grey shirt offering to fire the very rifle that 26 trained snipers had just refused to touch. Renner did not see cruelty in what he did next. He saw only a chance to make the general laugh, to break the unbearable tension in the air, to remind everyone present exactly whose range this was. "Sir," Renner said, grinning, half turning to the formation, so that all of them could share the joke with him. "Respectfully, Mr. Webb here cuts our grass. I'm not sure he's qualified to safely clear that weapon, let alone fire it accurately at 1400. Why don't we let the old-timer get back to his cart before he hurts himself or somebody else?" And several of the candidates laughed with him, because relief makes people cruel sometimes, and they were all just glad the terrible question had stopped being aimed at them. What none of those laughing young men could have known in that moment was that the thing they were laughing at was about to become the thing they would measure the rest of their careers against, and that one of them, a quiet candidate named Alvarez standing near the middle of the formation, was not laughing at all, but staring hard at the back of the old groundskeeper's grey shirt with a strange tightening in his chest, remembering a sentence spoken to him once at a picnic table about the waiting and the stillness, suddenly and uneasily certain that he had badly misjudged the man who said it. Harlan Webb did not chuckle, and he did not flinch, and he did not look away. He had been laughed at by far harder men than Cody Renner, in places where the laughter had been the very last sound some of those men ever made. He simply stood there at the back of the formation with his rolling cart parked beside him, his faded shirt buttoned to the throat against the morning chill, and he waited, the way he had learned to wait a long, long time ago. Not the impatient waiting of a man who wants something, but the deep mineral patience of a man in a hide watching a trail that might not give him a target for 2 full days. The kind of patience that is not the absence of feeling but the total mastery of it. He looked past Renner, past the laughing candidates, to the general, and he held the general's eyes, and there was something in that steady gaze that made the 4-star's own faint smile die in his throat. Because the general had spent a lifetime around shooters of every kind, and he knew, instantly and in his bones, the difference between a man who wanted attention and a man who simply, quietly knew a thing that the rest of the room did not yet know. The old groundskeeper's eyes were flat and calm and entirely without doubt, and a thin, cold current went down the general's spine, an old soldier's instinct that he could not yet put a name to. He raised one hand, palm out, and the laughter died. "Staff Sergeant," the general said slowly, his eyes never once leaving the old man at the back. "Stand down." And then to Harlan, "You, step up to the line." Renner's grin curdled on his face. The general had crossed a line, he thought. This whole day was meant to be about the candidates, about the school standing, about a once-in-a-decade chance to impress the most important Marine alive, and now a senile groundskeeper was going to fumble and drop an unfamiliar rifle and humiliate every one of them in front of the man whose opinion could shape all their careers. He stepped forward again, lower this time, his voice dropping to something urgent and almost pleading. "General, I have to advise against this. The liability alone. He's not certified anywhere near this line, he's 70-some years old. The recoil on that rifle could shatter his shoulder or worse. With respect, sir, this is a serious mistake, and I'd be failing my duty if I didn't say so plainly." But the general was no longer listening to Staff Sergeant Cody Renner at all. He was watching the old man walk. Harlan had let go of the cart's handle and started toward the firing line, and he did not shuffle, and he did not hesitate, and he did not hurry. He moved with the slow, complete economy of a man who had not wasted a single physical motion in 60 years. And when he finally reached the rifle lying on its mat, he did not snatch it up the way an eager boy would. He stood over it a long moment instead. He read the near wind flags first, then the far flags out by the distant target, his eyes moving between them, weighing the difference, the way another man reads a difficult sentence twice to be sure of its meaning. And then he knelt, and the specific way he knelt, the way his old body folded down around that rifle and went utterly, perfectly still, made a retired sergeant major standing near the general suddenly stop breathing in the middle of a breath. The sergeant major's name was Otis Pruitt, and he was 66 years old, long retired now, brought back to Quantico as a guest of honour for the general's visit, because he had spent 30 years as a combat sniper and a master instructor, and was himself something close to a living legend inside that schoolhouse. He had been standing at the general's elbow, half bored, watching the morning's proceedings with the tolerant, hooded eye of a very old hand who had seen every version of every ceremony a dozen times over. But when the old groundskeeper knelt down over that rifle, Otis Pruitt's tolerant boredom vanished off his face in an instant. He took a half-step forward without realizing he had moved, his lips parting, and he stared hard at the old man's hands. Because the old man was not gripping the rifle. He was settling down into it, building a firing position from the ground upward, bone stacked on bone, the rifle becoming an extension of his skeleton rather than a thing held in place by straining muscle. It was a technique Pruitt himself had taught to 1,000 young Marines over 30 years, and that almost none of them ever truly mastered in the end, because it could not be learned in a single season or even 10 of them. It took 20 hard years to teach a man's body to do that without a flicker of conscious thought. And there was something else too, something in the precise way the old man canted his head and laid his weathered cheek to the worn stock, and the way he drew that single dented brass cartridge out of his button shirt pocket and pressed it once, briefly, to his lips before he chambered it, that made the blood drain clean out of Otis Pruitt's face. He reached over and gripped the general's sleeve. "Sir," he whispered, his voice gone strange. "Sir, what is that man's name?" The general did not know and said so. He turned and put the question to the rangemaster, who consulted a clipboard and reported that the civilian contractor's name was Webb, Harlan Webb, groundskeeper, 19 years on station, nothing further. The name meant nothing at all to the general, but it did something to Otis Pruitt that the younger men on that range would talk about quietly among themselves for years afterward, because the old sergeant major, a hard man, a man not remotely given to displays of any kind, put one hand flat over his own mouth, and his eyes filled and overflowed, and he said, barely loud enough for the general to hear him over the snapping flags, "Webb! Oh dear God, it's Webb!" Down on the line, entirely oblivious to all of it, Harlan Webb had finished building his position and gone quiet inside it. He had the rifle, and he had the wind in his bones now, and he had the white plate 1,400 yards, downrange dancing and shrinking in the heat. He breathed in slowly through his nose, the way a man breathes when there is no hurry left anywhere in the world, and he let half of that breath ease out and held the rest of it, the old respiratory pause settling his heart rate, the front sight post drifting up to rest in the exact dead centre of his vision, as though it had simply decided that was where it would live. His finger took up the first slack in the trigger, and on the firing line of a United States Marine Corps range with a 4-star general and 26 of the finest young shooters in the entire Corps holding their breath behind him, a 78-year-old janitor in a faded grey shirt, prepared to do the one single thing that not one of them believed any living human being could still do. The rifle cracked, flat and hard, and the report rolled away across the lowlands. The recoil drove the old man's shoulder back, and he rode it without the slightest flinch, his cheek never once leaving the stock, his open eye never leaving the iron sights, and then a full second and a half later, while the bullet was still in the air crossing 1,400 yards of gusting, shifting Virginia wind, while every man on that range was leaning toward the distant target with his entire body, there came back across the grey lowland a single clear, musical, ringing note. The unmistakable clean chime of steel struck dead in the centre. The white plate jumped and spun hard on its chain, and a small puff of dust kicked up off the berm behind it where the round buried itself, and for one full second after that not a single person on range 11 made any sound at all. Then the line erupted. 26 candidates who had refused even to attempt the shot were suddenly shouting and grabbing each other by the shoulders, and the rangemaster was staring into his spotting scope with his jaw hanging slack, and Staff Sergeant Cody Renner stood frozen with his 2 certified championship hands hanging useless at his sides, because what he had just watched was, by every single law of marksmanship he had spent his whole adult life mastering, a flat impossibility, A cold bore, first-round hit at 1400 yards, full-value crosswind, iron sights, no spotter, fired by a man old enough to be his grandfather. Harlan Webb worked the bolt without any haste, caught the spent brass casing neatly in his open palm and slowly, with great and visible care, returned it to the front pocket of his faded grey shirt, settling it in beside the older dented cartridge that had never once left it. Then he stood up, his old left hip catching and protesting, and he looked once, briefly, at the steel still swinging on its chain-down range. And he said nothing at all. It was Otis Pruitt who finally broke the noise on that range. The old sergeant major walked down onto the firing line, straight past the stunned general, past the shouting candidates, past the frozen and forgotten Cody Renner, and he stopped directly in front of Harlan Webb, and he came to attention so sharply that his old boots cracked together like a rifle bolt, and he raised his right hand in a salute so crisp and so perfect it could have cut glass, and he held it there, rigid, unwavering. The whole range went dead quiet all over again. A decorated retired sergeant major rendering a full salute to a man they had all assumed was a janitor. Harlan looked back at him for a long, long moment, and something moved behind the old groundskeeper's flat eyes, a recognition rising slowly up from very deep and very cold water. "Otis," Harlan said at last, quietly, almost gently, "you got fat." And Otis Pruitt let out a bark of a laugh that broke apart halfway into something that was half a sob, and he dropped the salute and seized the old man by both shoulders with both his hands. Then he turned, still gripping Harlan tightly, and he faced the general and the silent formation of young men, and his voice, when it finally came, was not the practiced voice of a man delivering a speech. It was the raw, level voice of a man finally setting down a truth he had carried alone for 40 years. "You want to know who this is?" Otis Pruitt said. "You laughed at him. You called him the old-timer and told him to get back to his cart. Let me tell every one of you exactly who it was you were laughing at this morning." Somewhere in the middle of the formation, the candidate named Alvarez felt the floor of his understanding give way beneath him. He thought of the picnic table behind the equipment shed, and the sandwich in wax paper, and the rough, quiet voice that had told him it was never the wind that beat a man, it was the waiting. And he understood, all at once and with a kind of vertigo, that he had been taught the most important lesson of his career by a man he had walked past 1,000 times without ever once seeing. He was not the only one. Up and down the ranks, young men were running back through 19 years of careless mornings, the trash they had handed him, the cart they had told him to move, the times they had spoken across him as though he were a piece of the building. And the shame of it was settling over the whole formation like a cold front rolling in. Cody Renner stood at the front of all of it, and he had stopped breathing, and he was thinking of the exact words he had used. The old-timer, before he hurts himself. He would hear those words in his own voice for years. "This man," Otis Pruitt said, his weathered hand still locked tight on Harlan Webb's shoulder, his voice carrying clear across the silent range, "is Gunnery Sergeant Harlan Webb, United States Marine Corps, retired. 2 combat tours in the Republic of Vietnam in 1968 and again in 1969, 1st Marine Division, Scout Sniper Platoon, operating out of Hill 55. He let that last name land. "The same Hill 55, General, the very same ridge, that you stood up there and told these candidates about not 1 hour ago in that schoolhouse, while this man emptied your wastebaskets behind you." A low sound moved through the formation like wind through grass. The general's face had gone the colour of ash. Pruitt went on, his voice steady and terrible and unhurried now. "When I was a young man at this very school, a boy really, they showed us a training film, a position film, just a man behind a rifle, building his hold, breaking his shot, over and over, and the instructors told us there had been a shooter, over there, whose confirmed engagement distances were so far out, so far beyond what the manual said was possible, that the brass classified the records and sealed them, because nobody back at the Pentagon believed the spotting reports, and they did not want those numbers turning up in the newspapers and getting called propaganda. They never once put his name on that film. They just called him the Standard. They told us, every one of us, that if we could ever in our lives build a position half as clean as the man in that film, we would be a sniper worthy of the title." Pruitt's voice finally cracked straight through. "I have watched that film maybe 200 times across my life. I have shown it myself to 1,000 young Marines in this schoolhouse, and I just stood here and watched the man in that film put 1 cold round through a 12-inch plate at 1,400 yards, with iron sights and no spotter, while wearing the same grey shirt he uses to carry out our trash. Nobody on that range moved. The wind flags snapped on their poles and not one man moved a muscle. The general took a single step forward, and his voice, when at last he spoke, had lost every last ounce of its window-rattling 4-star authority and become instead the careful, quiet voice of a younger man addressing a respected elder. "Gunnery Sergeant Webb," he said, "is what he's telling us true?" And Harlan Webb looked at the general for a long moment, and then he looked past him, out at the 26 young candidates standing in their silent ranks, and he finally spoke more than 3 words together for the first time all morning. "I had a spotter," he said. His voice was rough and low and unhurried, and it carried in the dead silence the way still water carries sound. Corporal Daniel Reyes, best eyes that the good Lord ever set in a man's head. He could read a wind I couldn't even feel on my own skin, could tell me a quarter-value shift 400 yards out just from the way the heat moved over the grass. On that ridge the general was telling you all about. Autumn of '69, they sent the 2 of us out for a target that, in the end, we never got. And on the long way back, the trail behind us went hot, and Danny stepped exactly where I had told him to step, where I'd put my own boot a half-second before." Harlan paused. "And it should have been me. It was supposed to be me. It was always supposed to be me, and it was him." His weathered hand came up slowly to the front pocket of his shirt, and he drew out the small dented brass cartridge, and he held it up between 2 fingers so the spring-light caught and ran along its battered curve. "This is the last round I ever fired in that country. I kept it for him, and every single shot I have taken in the 51 years since, every one, I have fired it for the man who didn't come home so that I could." He closed his fist gently around the brass, and not one of those 26 young men was the least bit ashamed to let the general see him weep openly where he stood. The story spread the way only that exact kind of story ever can. The rangemaster's spotting scope had been quietly running video the entire time, as it always did for a flag officer's demonstration, and a candidate near the front had caught Otis Pruitt's whole speech on the phone in his breast pocket. Within a single week, the clip of an old groundskeeper ringing steel at 1,400 yards and a weeping sergeant major rendering him a salute had gone everywhere a thing can go, and the United States Marine Corps, to its very great and lasting credit, did not allow it to remain merely a viral curiosity to be forgotten in a month. They went looking instead for the records. And it turned out that Otis Pruitt had been entirely right about the classification, because it took a genuine and stubborn act of bureaucratic will, pushed from the very top to finally unseal what they eventually found buried in the archives, the engagement logs of a single scout sniper team operating out of Hill 55 across 1968 and 1969, confirmed distances that had been stamped and sealed decades ago as simply too improbable to ever publish, and, folded in among them, a recommendation. It had been written by a Marine captain who was long since dead, and it had never once been acted upon in the grinding chaos of a war that was already winding down toward its bitter end. The recommendation was that Gunnery Sergeant Harlan Webb be formally recognised for his actions on the ridge where Corporal Daniel Reyes had been killed, where Webb, his own left hip shattered by the same blast, had refused all morphine so that he might stay clear-headed enough to navigate, and had carried his fallen friend more than 4 miles back through hostile country on his back, and had walked into the wire at Hill 55 at the grey edge of dawn, with the body of Daniel Reyes across his shoulders, and had not spoken one word to any living soul for 3 full days afterward. They held the ceremony 6 months later, in the spring, out on the broad parade deck at Quantico under a sky scrubbed clean by rain. Harlan Webb had not wanted it. He had said more than once and with quiet stubbornness that the medals belonged to Danny, that he himself had only ever been the man who happened to be holding the rifle that day, that there was nothing to honour in surviving when better men had not. But it was Otis Pruitt who finally talked him into it, sitting at Harlan's kitchen table over bad coffee, telling him plainly that a man does not get to decide all alone what his own life has meant to the people who came up behind him, that the honour was not really for Harlan at all, but for the 26 young men who needed to see it given, and for every young Marine who had ever watched the new film. So Harlan put on a borrowed dress blue coat that did not quite close right across his old shoulders, and he stood out on that parade deck while a 4-star general, the very same one, pinned upon his chest the recognition that a dead captain had first recommended 51 years before. The 26 candidates were all there, every single one of them, graduated now and posted out to units across the fleet, and they had each specifically requested leave and orders to attend. And Staff Sergeant Cody Renner was there as well. He had asked for and been granted one single thing, to be allowed to apologise to the old man directly, to his face, in front of them all. Harlan heard the young man out. This gifted instructor who had laughed first and laughed loudest on that range 6 months before, who now stood before him with his cover in his hands and his voice gone unsteady and his eyes on the deck. And when Renner had finally finished saying everything he had clearly rehearsed 100 times and could barely get through even once, Harlan Webb simply reached out and put one weathered hand on the young man's shoulder, the same way Pruitt had gripped his. "You're a better shot right now than I ever was at your age, son," the old man said, and he meant it, and Renner's head came up in surprise. "I've watched you on that line for 2 years. You've got the hands, you've got the eye. What you don't have yet is the thing that takes the years." He let that settle. "Just you remember one thing the rest of your life. You never once know who it is that's emptying your trash can." And Cody Renner, 2-time service rifle champion, a hard and proud young man, bowed his head and said yes, Gunnery Sergeant, that he would carry that with him until the day he died. And by every account of the men who knew him afterward, he did. The Scout Sniper Instructor School made one quiet, deliberate, permanent change in the month that followed that spring ceremony. They formally retired the old position film, the one with no name beneath it, the one Otis Pruitt had watched 200 times, and they made a new one in its place. They sat Harlan Webb down in front of a single camera in a quiet room, and they asked him not to perform anything, but simply to talk, about the wind and the breathing and the long bottomless patience of the hide, about reading the heat across the grass, and about the small dented thing he carried in his shirt pocket every day, and why he had carried it for 51 years. He talked for 3 hours. They cut almost none of it. New candidates who watch that film now say the strangest part is not the marksmanship he describes, but the long pauses, the moments where the old man stops and looks somewhere past the camera, and you understand that he is back on a ridge in 1969 and that he has been there, in some quiet corner of himself, every single day for 51 years. More than one young Marine has come out of that darkened room and gone looking for whoever empties their barracks trash, just to learn the man's name. And at the very front of the schoolhouse, on the wall where every new class of candidates files past it, each morning on their way in, they hung a single framed photograph. It is a young Marine in 1969, lean and sun-darkened and impossibly alive, lying easy behind a rifle in the tall elephant grass of Hill 55, and beside him, propped on his elbows with a battered pair of binoculars and a wide, reckless grin, is his spotter. Both of them are impossibly young in the photograph. Neither of them yet knows which one of them is going to come home. Beneath the picture, on a small polished brass plate, are engraved 2 names, given equal size, neither one above the other. Gunnery Sergeant Harlan Webb, Corporal Daniel Reyes, and beneath the 2 names the words the old man asked them to engrave there instead of any list at all of his decorations. The shot is never just yours. Somebody is always spotting for you. Remember to thank them while they can still hear you. Harlan Webb worked at that school 3 more years after the ceremony, until his old hip finally retired him for good and for real, and to the very end he parked the rough idling tan Ford under the same loblolly pine and emptied the same trash cans into the same rolling cart. Except that now the candidates fought one another, openly and good-naturedly, for the simple privilege of carrying his cart for him and walking the rangers at his side, asking him about the wind. He told them what he could. He passed away 2 winters ago, quietly and without fuss, in his sleep, in the small clapboard house where he had lived alone since his wife Eleanor died. Eleanor, whom he had married just 3 weeks after walking out of that war with a limp and a silence, and who had spent the next 40 years gently learning how to wake a man from the dreams he would never once describe to her. They buried Harlan with full military honours on a cold, clear morning, and the 26, older now, some of them with grey of their own coming in at the temples, came from wherever in the world the Corps had scattered them, everyone who could get leave, and they stood in a long quiet rank at the back the way he always had. Otis Pruitt, gone frail himself now, and leaning on a cane, stood at the graveside in the wind and rendered one final trembling salute to his old friend. And here, in the end, is the one thing worth carrying away from the whole of it. The thing that 26 young men learned on a windy range one ordinary morning and never once unlearned for the rest of their lives. The single most dangerous mistake you can ever make about another human being is to quietly decide that you already know exactly who they are. The man emptying your trash can carried the dead 4 miles on a broken hip and never told a soul. The quiet ones, the overlooked ones, the ones standing in faded shirts at the back of the room with their eyes on the middle distance. They are very often the ones who have already done the single hardest thing you will ever be asked to do in your life and done it and carried it home alone and never once asked you to notice. If a forgotten hero, finally and at long last given his salute, moved something in you today, then honour Harlan Webb and every quiet warrior like him the only way that still matters. Subscribe, share his story, and never again let an old man stand unseen at the back of the room